Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Hi, everyone. My name is Diya, and these are my colleagues, Nareh, Manvi, and Elvyn. And we're Imperial medical students who have just completed a BSc in remote medicine, and we're so excited to talk to you today about living on the moon. Firstly, we'd all just like to say a big thank you to Thais just for this opportunity and all our help and guidance as our supervisor. So, the moon is a barely explored barren land, and for us to make further progress, humans would need to survive there for months or even years. But is this even possible? Our bodies evolved to thrive under Earth's conditions. So, what happens when we relocate to the moon? We'll dive into the available research and explore the fascinating but sometimes strange biological changes that might happen. We'll finally discuss the sources of these predictions and any limitations they might have, and then we'll look towards the future. Firstly, let's start at the very beginning of lunar exploration, the Apollo missions. Nareh, can you tell us a bit more about them?
Yes, definitely. And today is a very exciting day. It's International Moon Day, where we celebrate 55 years since the successful Apollo 11 mission that led to Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin taking their first steps on the moon. So the Apollo missions were NASA's aim to land humans on the moon, and following the success of Apollo 11, NASA conducted 6 more Apollo missions, with Apollo 17 being the last one in 1972. And each of these missions have contributed greatly to our understanding of the moon, its geology, and also the effects it can have on the human body as well. So if we fast forward to today, we are now on the brink of a new era of lunar exploration with NASA's Artemis program, which is a really exciting initiative that not only aims to land humans on the moon again, but also emphasizes a notable desire to have long-term space inhabitation. So the plan is to try and establish a permanent moon base, and also to have the lunar gateway from which further missions can be conducted into Mars, and we can just further our space exploration from there. It's also a really exciting opportunity to conduct research through international collaboration, as when the world was gripped in the space race, there was a lot of competition between nations to try and become the first nation to land on the moon, whereas now there seems to be a lot more collaboration between nations, which is really exciting, especially for the Artemis program and the Mars missions.
Yeah, amazing. And so these missions make up such a huge part of human history, and it's just so exciting that humans are planning to return. So, to focus back on the topic of our presentation, how exactly does the moon's environment differ from the Earth?
So, of course, we know that the lunar environment is drastically different to that on Earth, and we've kind of condensed these down to 4 main differences. So, we've got hypergravity, so lower gravity on the moon, a different atmosphere, radiation exposure, and lunar dust. And we're going to delve into these one by one. So, first of all, we have gravity. We know that the mass of the Earth creates a gravitational acceleration of 9.8 meters per second squared. However, the moon's gravity is about a sixth of this. And while this lower gravity might be fun to experience, I think it'll be quite fun to be jumping around on the moon personally. We also do know that this hypergravity can cause long-term issues to human health, and this is something that we're going to be exploring further on in our talk today. We also know that the atmosphere of the moon is very different to that on Earth. So we know that the Earth has multiple layers of atmosphere that helps provide us protection from radiation and other such things from space. The atmosphere on the moon is very different. It is extremely thin, with only a trace amount of gases, including helium, neon, hydrogen, and argon. This means that, firstly, there's no air to breathe on the moon. Secondly, the moon is subject to extreme temperatures, ranging from about 127 degrees all the way down to minus 173 at night. And also, it's very much exposed to radiation, which is going to be our next slide. So the types of radiation that the moon is exposed to is different, and we can categorize them further from deep space radiation as galactic cosmic rays, which are high energy particles. We've got solar particles, which are emitted by the sun, and also electromagnetic radiation, such as X-rays and gamma rays. The moon is also not protected from solar wind, which is a stream of charged particles that arrive from the sun. And this is because it doesn't have a magnetic field. And finally, it is also subject to micrometeorite impacts. These micrometeorites might be burnt up in the Earth's atmosphere. However, they cause a lot of damage to the moon's surface and metamorphosis of the moon's regolith layer of ground. So what does that mean for the moon? Well, or for astronauts? Well, it just means that the moon is subjected to space weathering, and this leads to the formation of lunar dust particles. These particles are renowned for being very abrasive in nature, very angular and irregular in shape, as you can see in the top two photos. And even 2 hours spent on the moon led to damage to the astronauts' spacesuits and vacuum seals, and they considered it one of the major hazards of going to the moon. And the Apollo programs really gave the first insights into the challenges of lunar dust. And whilst they were protected by their spacesuits, they were very much exposed to the lunar dust due to its adhesive properties. So lunar dust has electrostatic properties, which means it's incredibly difficult to remove. And as you can see in the top left photo, it's coating the boots of the astronaut Harrison Schmitt that is pictured there as he's collecting lunar soil. We can also see it coating astronaut Eugene Cernan's face as well, post his extravehicular activities. So that just shows that there is definitely an exposure risk to lunar dust and something that needs to be considered.
So just to recap, that there are 4 main environmental differences on the moon. We've got radiation, the lack of atmosphere, low gravity known as hypergravity, and the presence of lunar dust. So now we're going to talk about how this will affect human health. So if we first look at hypergravity, there are very few studies on actual moon hypergravity. So most of the evidence we're going to talk about is extrapolated from microgravity studies. And we are assuming that the effects will be similar, if not slightly less pronounced. But we will talk about the limitations of doing this later on in the talk. So as soon as you leave Earth's gravity and enter microgravity, you're likely to experience intense nausea and vertigo. This is due to space motion sickness. And it's caused by the discrepancy between our visual input, which perceives movement, and the lack of response from our proprioceptive organs, like our semicircular canals, and because these are dependent on gravity. Luckily, this nauseous feeling should disappear within a few days, as the vestibular system is the first to adapt. Elvyn, can you expand upon what other physiological changes we think will happen immediately upon entering hypergravity?
Sure. So there is a phenomenon called cephalad fluid shift. And to understand it, let's break the term down. So cephalad literally means towards the head. And fluid in this case refers to blood, interstitial fluid, which is the fluid between tissues, and lymphatic fluid, which is the fluid circulating through the lymphatic system. So moving on to the cardio effects. So the shift of blood towards the head ultimately increases the blood volume within the central circulation, including heart and pulmonary vasculature. In response to the increase in venous return, the heart increases its cardiac output. In other words, the heart works harder. Initially, there is a temporary increase in the heart size to manage this increase in venous return. However, in the long term, the overall reduced workload means that the heart size may decrease due to loss in its muscle. Moving on to the neurological effects. Again, this is linked with the cephalad fluid shift towards the head. It has a physiological impact with facial edema, which is buildup of fluids in the face, nasal congestion, and also increased intracranial pressure. In the long term, this can cause a condition described by NASA in 2011 as spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, which is also known as SANS. And as we can see on the image over here, we can see optic disc edema, which is the buildup of fluid within the eyes pushing the optic disc, as shown by the enlarged optic disc post-flight, shown by the circle.
Okay, so we can see that fluid shift affects quite a lot of the body systems. And what about the lungs? Does hypergravity also have effect on the lungs?
Yeah. So in terms of the respiratory system, the chest wall moves outwards and upwards to form something known as pigeon chest. And this is due to an overall loss in muscle tone in the muscles of the chest. Also, the diaphragm and abdominal contents move upwards into the thoracic cavity, therefore reducing thoracic volume. A study monitoring the pulmonary function of space travelers shows that just after 2 days of exposure to microgravity, there is a 5% reduction in vital capacity in some space travelers. However, between flights day 4 and 9, vital capacity returns to normal levels of humans in Earth. This suggests that there could be acclimatization to microgravity after just 1 week of exposure.
And finally, are there any other systems affected by hypergravity? So I know that astronauts often come back weaker and sometimes even unable to walk. So why is this the case?
Yeah, so on Earth, there is mechanical load on bones and muscles through everyday activities such as walking, which manage bone density and muscle strength. Even to stand upright, the body needs to use its muscles to combat gravity. However, the lack of gravity has a significant impact on the bones of our body, with decreased bone mineral density. This poses a serious risk of fractures and premature osteoporosis, which is the decrease of bone density at an earlier stage than normal. Research has shown a loss of bone density in the spine and hip region of around 1 to 1.5% per month, according to bone scans. This loss in bone density is significantly greater than the older individuals experiencing primary osteoporosis on Earth, which is a condition where bone density decreases due to age. There is also a significant risk of muscle breakdown, as there is a lack of contraction due to lessened mechanical load. The loss of muscle is most noted in the limbs, specifically in the calf and thigh muscles. And in order to combat this, the ISS prescribes up to 2.5 hours of daily exercise through a mix of resistant exercises using the advanced resistive exercise device, which is shown on the left-hand side, and also using aerobic exercise using the T2 treadmill shown in the image on the right.
So there are a multitude of changes in the body as a response to low gravity. And we can see from this graph here the time it takes for each body system to adapt and stabilize to this change. Neurovestibular systems adapt the quickest, as you can see, and bone and calcium systems actually just never really adapt, and instead they get steadily worse. So this is why the countermeasures that Elvyn mentioned are so important to maintain bone health. And we can see radiation risk is also steadily increasing on this graph. So why is this happening?
This is an excellent question and something that really needs to be considered in missions to the moon. We know that on Earth we are subject to a certain degree of radiation, and that this is increased as we go to space. So it's roughly 60 times more on the International Space Station, and scientists have been trying to understand what the radiation risk is on the moon, and they've come to around the 200 times risk of exposure of radiation on the moon than on Earth. And it's been quite difficult to get a number of this, as our understanding is partly theorized from the understanding of impact to the body is partly theorized from bomb survivors and radiotherapy patients, and very difficult as we haven't got that many individuals who have actually gone to the moon. We don't have long-term studies of radiation risk exposure that we can draw on. So a lot of these are theories and predictions to what can be done, but we do know that radiation exposure does have an impact on the human body, and we can try to start to understand what these impacts can be. So in terms of our immediate effects, we can term it acute radiation sickness. So we can have brain fatigue and nausea experienced by astronauts, diarrhea and gastrointestinal upset, and the immune system can take a big dip in the initial stages. And later on, we have DNA damage in the cell nucleus that can lead to tumor formation and also damage to the central nervous system. It's theorized that there could be inflammation caused in the lungs, and studies are still inconclusive about that. Potentially, the damage to blood cells can lead to leukemias. And also a notable one is reproductive cell damage. So if we're thinking about long-term populations on the moon, this is a huge one, as it could impact how the reproducibility of humans on the moon. It's very difficult to say because, as I said, a lot of studies are taken from patients on Earth, but astronauts are very fit individuals and they don't necessarily reflect the cohort of patients on Earth. But it is interesting in terms of the Artemis missions, where we're going to be having the first female land on the moon. This is important as females are more at risk of radiation due to exposure of the ovaries and breasts, leading to cancers in those areas. And therefore, younger female athletes have a lower threshold of radiation that they can undergo in their careers than perhaps an older man in their 50s. And this is definitely a consideration that needs to be made in terms of planning missions and also recruitment of missions as well, and how these astronauts can best be protected. So in terms of protection, there's multiple things that can be done. So the first thing we can consider is physical shielding. So this can be done using regolith, so the moon's soil itself, and building habitats from that, and also taking materials from Earth. So polyethylene materials can be used, and this is also used in the International Space Station as well as other special composites as well that are being designed. We can also have habitat design as well. So we know that lunar caves are an excellent place where we can start building a population on the moon, as they are underground and can help provide substantial protection from radiation. We can also conduct regular health checks, so ensuring that astronauts are medically monitored with health screenings to monitor for signs of radiation-induced conditions, and also help educate astronauts of what their personal individual radiation exposure is and what they should be able to tolerate. Operational strategies are also a great way. So I mentioned that one of the exposures, that one of the things the moon's atmosphere doesn't protect it against is solar flares. And this is much like the weather we have on Earth. This is something that can be predicted, almost like a weather forecast. So having lunar operations conducted when solar flares are at a minimum can help minimize the radiation exposure as well. And of course, further research needs to be done on building new materials that are more advanced and offer better radiation protection. Revising the spacesuits that astronauts wear, and exploring other technologies such as magnetic or electrostatic shielding that could help offer additional protection to astronauts.
So on the topic of protection, another consequence of the lack of atmosphere are the temperature fluctuations. Due to the lack of atmosphere on the moon, not being able to trap or block the sun's heat, temperature can fluctuate between minus 173 degrees at night and 127 degrees in the day. The image shown shows the temperature extremities on the south pole of the moon. This part of the moon features areas where no sunlight reaches it. You can see the blue patches, which represent a temperature of around 60 Kelvin, which is around minus 213 degrees, and highs of around 300 Kelvin, which is just above 0 degrees. Therefore, hypothermia and hyperthermia will pose a serious risk for humans on the moon. In order to combat this, spacesuits and habitats on the moon must be equipped with thermal regulation systems.
Yeah, so that's so interesting that I don't know if anyone saw, but recently, 3 days ago, NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter spotted radar reflections, which indicate the presence of a cave. And this cave seems to provide access to like tunnels. And this may be perfect for sheltering these astronauts from radiation and the surface temperature that Nareh and Elvyn just talked about. So would caves like this also protect against the hazards of lunar dust?
Definitely they can. They help provide a natural shelter. Inside caves, dust is more likely to settle more quickly. And by having an infrastructure in the caves built by the astronauts, we can help try and control entry and exit using airlocked clean rooms and develop filtration systems. And this is really important as lunar dust definitely poses risks to astronaut health. So firstly, the size of lunar dust can be incredibly small. And this means that it's it can be very inhalable. It can land on any surface and nook and cranny. And there's going to be a high exposure to it by astronauts if measures aren't taken. Secondly, because of the electrostatic forces of the lunar dust, it can levitate above the ground. So this further increases the risk of exposure. And it also means that within the lung, the lunar dust can be distributed and coat a higher surface area of the lung, which can lead to further damage. And the final thing to mention is that lunar dust has a high concentration of silicon dioxide, approximately 50%. And the reason why this is important, as even though we don't have long-term studies of astronauts being exposed to the lunar dust, we do have long-term studies on Earth to miners being exposed to silica and silicon dioxide. And it's been shown that long-term exposure leads to a chronic and progressive lung disease called silicosis, which can occur within 5 to 10 years of long-term silicon dioxide exposure. And this can lead to a range of symptoms such as coughing and lung damage. And you can see in the image that there's fibrosis or scarring occurring in the lungs, and this is not reversible. This paired with the fact that lunar dust is very sharp and irregular and angular in structure means that a further lung damage can occur. So even though we don't have these long-term studies done in lunar dust, we can assume that exposure can lead to damage in the lungs. And not only just to the lungs, it can also cause skin and eye irritation because it's so abrasive. It can damage equipment, it can cause electronic interference, it can cause low visibility, habitat contamination. So definitely something that needs to be considered. And as I mentioned, the ways that we can mitigate this is either through air filtration systems, protection during extravehicular activities, airlocks, clean rooms, and the like.
Okay, so that basically covers a few of the main physiological considerations of living on the moon. But what about psychological considerations? How does the human mind hold up in space? Apollo 11 astronaut Buzz Aldrin described the surface of the moon as a magnificent desolation. Imagine looking outside your window and seeing a dark, grey, dusty wasteland. It can probably get pretty depressing. Isolation is probably the main concern, as these astronauts are so far from Earth, their family and their friends, and just the larger human community. This isolation can contribute to feelings of loneliness and depression, and just the experience of seeing Earth from the moon, while absolutely breathtaking, can also induce feelings of existentialism and lead astronauts to feel insignificant in the universe. The limited social interaction with the same small group of crew members could also lead to conflicts and stress and many arguments between crewmates. And also, on the moon, a day lasts about 29.5 Earth days, meaning prolonged periods of light and darkness. And this irregular light exposure can lead to insomnia and further contribute to feelings of depression. This is why it's so important to implement strategies that maintain mental health for astronauts. So now we've learned that the environment can affect the body in many different ways. But across all the Apollo missions, humans have only spent about 161 hours on the moon. So how do we get all the evidence for all these physiological and psychological changes?
That is a very good question. So where exactly has all this data and research come from? So, like you said, we have the moon. But as you were explaining, Diya, we haven't been on there for very long. So the research and data that we have can't all be from moon studies. So how exactly do we actually research being on the moon without being on the moon, I guess? So we use something called space analogs, and these are essentially methods that mimic an element of the extreme space environment. And they're commonly used for testing engineering processes, understanding the changes in the human physiology and psychology, and even how machines and humans interact. So if we look at some examples of space analogs, the International Space Station is an analog that resembles some of the conditions that you see on the moon. So it's visited by astronauts to conduct research and experiments within the space environment. And the fact that it's in low Earth orbit, it experiences microgravity, and we can explore some of the effects of prolonged exposure to space. However, using this as a research station isn't the most practical method. It's expensive and it can carry a lot of risk. So how about we explore something that's a bit more closer, maybe on Earth? So we can carry out experiments in the lab. For example, we can investigate the effects of radiation by exposing tissue samples and observing their effects. Likewise, we can also test the effectiveness of materials that we develop against lunar dust particles by creating artificial lunar dust in the lab.
Okay, so these lab experiments sound a lot easier to achieve than just sending astronauts to the ISS every time we want to conduct an experiment. But it also sounds kind of simple. How accurately can it represent the complexity of human experience in space or on the moon?
You're right. So humans are very complex, and lab studies are not always representative of what the human will experience. So we use some other analogs on Earth to simulate the effects of the lunar environment. So bed rest studies are an example of an analog, and they look at the effects of partial gravity on the human body. So in these studies, as you can see here, participants would typically lie in a bed at a specific angle for prolonged periods of time. And this can be up to like 70, 80 days if we're wanting to investigate the long-term effects of partial gravity. And it is within this bed that the participant will carry out all their activities, not just sleeping, they're eating, drinking, and any tasks they've been asked to perform, they'll all be conducted within the bed. And if we want to look at the moon's hypergravity, it's a head up tilt of 9.5 degrees, as you can see in this image here. And by lying like this for a long period of time, your body reacts in a similar way to how it would in hypergravity. And like Elvyn was explaining, so you'd see sort of changes in the blood distribution, your muscle activity, and your bone density would also change. And we can use these to explore the effects of hypergravity on the cardiovascular, musculoskeletal, and metabolic systems, as well as test some of those exercise protocols and countermeasures that Elvyn was talking about, and they're used to prevent the deconditioning of muscles. And we can alter the angle of these beds to create different degrees of partial gravity. So for example, if we do a head downward tilt of 6 degrees, it can be an analog for microgravity. This here is a diagram of parabolic flights, another analog that we can use for hypergravity. So you have the specialized aircraft that will cruise at a constant altitude and then climb up at an angle about 45 degrees, at which point you'd experience hypergravity, so gravity greater than what you experience on Earth. And then you'll enter a period of free fall where you'd experience a partial gravity, followed by a second period of hypergravity as the plane levels out to the steady altitude. And we can change the angle that the plane flies at and its flight path to create the different degrees of partial gravity again, including the moon's hypergravity. The downside of this is that you only get 20 to 30 seconds of hypergravity, and this limits the research that we have to transient exposure to partial gravity, and we can't really assess the long-term exposure. And so there are many other ways that we can explore hypergravity through analogs. So this is a lower body positive pressure system, which uses suspension and low pressure from on the lower half of the body to simulate hypergravity. And this is a centrifuge where they use a centrifugal force to also mimic hypergravity.
Okay, so these are all analogs looking specifically at the effect of hypergravity on the human body. But as Nareh explained, there are many other factors of the lunar environment, such as lunar dust or the atmosphere. Are there any other analogs that help us study these environmental factors?
Yes, of course, there are so many more, but we are very limited on time here, so we're only going to cover a few. So we can get hypobaric or low pressure and hyperbaric, high pressure chambers. And these are analogs that we can use to explore the impact of high and low pressure on the body. So this is what the chambers look like on the inside. You can have multiple participants go inside and it will be sealed from the outside. Outside the chamber, you'll see this control desk where you'll be monitoring and controlling the pressure within the tank and as well as people inside the tank. And as Nareh was explaining further earlier, the low pressure and the lack of oxygen it's impossible for humans to survive on the lunar surface, and that is outside of any sort of lunar base that you might establish or spacecraft. And to carry out these moonwalks, or what are known as extravehicular activity, astronauts have to wear that special spacesuit. And these suits themselves are hypobaric, so low pressure, which is why understanding the changes of pressure on the body is important. And so this in particular, we'd look at things like the heart, the lungs, and your neurological brain systems and see what happens there.
It's crazy that the act of like putting on spacesuits can also have health considerations. So all these methods try and teach us about very specific health aspects of living on the moon. But is there an analog that can simulate actually living on the moon? For example, like I've heard that there are a few remote places on Earth where bases have been set up to really experience life on the moon. Is this true?
Yeah, so what you're describing is analog habitats. And these are essentially a space, an area which is designed to simulate aspects of a crewed space mission. So looking at like people interaction and things like that in an enclosed space. And we can call these missions analog missions. So these can be used to test human factors like the effects of confinement and isolation, team performance, as well as the human-computer interaction again. So this here is the Concordia Research Station, and this is based in Antarctica, which is one of the most remote places on Earth. There's no civilization nearby. Antarctica is also great for testing this sort of thing because it has a very harsh environment. So, for example, you experience prolonged periods of darkness and isolation, and we can look at the effects that these might have on your biological clock or your circadian rhythm. And this is a lot of what you can experience in space or on the moon. This here, so NASA's Extreme Environment Missions Operation Project, or NEMO, this operated analog missions to what you see here, and this is an underwater research lab called Aquarius. It's situated off the coast of Florida, 19 meters underwater. And this can also simulate the feeling of living on a spacecraft or a lunar base. And you can also go out and test or pretend or mimic extravehicular activity. And this is good because diving uses a lot of similar processes to moonwalks, for example, the changes in pressure and the oxygenation. And the other advantage of the underwater research aspect is the fact that we can use the buoyancy of water, we can add weights and create neutral buoyancy and simulate this sort of partial gravity feeling and conduct research with a combination of environmental factors. This here is the Lunaris, which is another analog habitat, and it's situated in Poland. So here is what it looks like on the inside. And I'd imagine that a lot of analog habitats would be something similar. So you've got the research station aspect here, which is where the astronauts will live, do all their research, carry out their activities of daily living, essentially. And just like a space shuttle in a sort of confined space. And there's a separate space here where you can carry out extravehicular activity, just like you might on a space shuttle or the moon. So there's a very large variety of analog habitats. I've only covered 3, but they all have some sort of similar factors. So creating this physiological or psychological strain on the human body, and we can use it to research the impact of the isolation side of things, group psychology, also implement some of the telemedicine research that's been going on. Okay, so here is like a mini summary and of what the analogs that we've looked at. So these are a massive range of what we could do, and they all simulate the effects of the lunar environment. And we can organize and base these on something called fidelity, which is how detailed or realistic the analog is to its environment. So, for example, the analogs in the lab settings on Earth would be low fidelity analogs, as looking at isolated cells on a slide isn't very representative of human health. But they're definitely good to help guide research, especially when we're looking at technology, developing prototypes. On the other extreme is the International Space Station, which is an example of a high-fidelity analog. It's more comprehensive, but it carries more risk and is expensive, as we discussed earlier. And finally, all of these analogs in the middle that we discussed are something what we'd call medium fidelity. It's sort of a compromise between the cost and risk aspect. And a lot of the research that we have in lunar medicine or space medicine has been carried out in this sort of medium fidelity area.
Okay, amazing. So these are all wonderful research methods that try and teach us about living on the moon. But despite that, there is still a significant gap in the literature. So a lot of the studies are biased to a white male population, and there is a lack of studies in other populations. So future studies should try and incorporate a more ethnically diverse cohort and female participants to close the gap in the literature. Also, each of the analogs mentioned have their own set of limitations. So for example, the Earth hypergravity analogs are still influenced by Earth's gravity, despite trying their best to replicate hypergravity. And even the highest fidelity analog, the ISS, measures microgravity as opposed to hypergravity. So it is still not completely specific to the lunar surface. Experiments also tend to measure one specific aspect of human health on the moon. So we do not know what the combined result of all these environmental stresses will be. In an ideal world, we just all conduct all experiments on the lunar surface to get the most accurate data. But this isn't possible. So what are the barriers to researching on the moon?
Yeah, so like you said, there are many factors that limit the research that we do in space and the moon. So just to cover a few, for example, the finance and funding is one of the biggest issues. And a lot of this comes from public or government sector organizations. And for this, we require there to be enough interest in what's going on and why should we send people to the moon, essentially. And one of the reasons why it was managed quite well in the 1960s was the fact that the excitement and the political interest of the space race. And this is what funded and eventually landed the Apollo 11 crew on the moon. Since then, a lot of the priorities and perspectives have changed, and we've not really seen any humans return to the moon since. And in a post-pandemic world where the economies are still recovering, humans and research on the moon hasn't really been a biggest priority as of yet. And as well as this, there's inevitably a lot of ethical considerations. For example, sending people to the moon, there's a risk to life, and we don't fully understand the effects of prolonged exposure to the hostile lunar environment. Should we really send people there? That's a question that could get asked. We also live in turbulent times of geopolitical unrest and climate change. People will question the need for researching lunar habitation. When there's already so many issues on Earth, how is this essentially benefiting humanity? And as well as this, the environmental impact of inhabiting the moon, it's going to be immense, both on the Earth and on the moon. So the moon is currently fairly intact and untouched, and people argue that we have this responsibility to preserve the surface and its resources from damage or exploitation. It is, however, undeniable that bases and settlements on the lunar surface or on the moon are definitely the way forward and will be the gateway for deeper space exploration, opening up Mars and beyond, essentially. So where exactly are we headed in the future?
Yeah, so currently research on the effects of the moon's low gravity on human health has mostly relied on simulations on Earth or data from the International Space Station's microgravity environment. This means our understanding of the effects of hypergravity is based on extrapolation, which aren't always accurate, but they are essential for our understanding. However, now with SpaceX pioneering space tourism, we now have a unique opportunity to conduct medical research on humans experiencing hypergravity. This could revolutionize our knowledge, preparing us for future lunar settlements.